So welcome everybody to our panel on career opportunities in education and EdTech. I'm Neelam Chowdhary, Executive Director of Global Learning Programs at Asia Society Center for Global Education. And for our discussion today, I'm delighted to introduce you to our panelists. We have Yalan King, and she is the Chief Operating Officer of Mandarin Matrix. Yalan is an innovator of AI-based personalized language learning products and services. And she's also the co-founder and president of the Mandarin Institute and a program director for StarTalk, part of the U.S. National Security Language Initiative. Welcome, Yalan. And we also have Christopher Livaccari. He is the head of Presidio Knolls Schools in San Francisco and an educator, author, and former U.S. diplomat. He's also the author of New Ways of Seeing, How Multilingualism Opens Our Eyes and Trains Our Minds for a Complex World, and co-author of Structures of Mandarin Chinese for Speakers of English 1 and 2. He's also the author of Chinese Language Learning in the Early Grades and the Chinese for Tomorrow series, among many other essays and articles on language, learning, education, and culture. He's also a former colleague of mine, so I'm so happy to see you, Chris. I'm honored to be speaking to both of you today, so let's just get started. Okay. So first, although I gave an introduction to both of you, I'd love it if you could just once again kind of just tell us exactly what you're doing right now, your current title, and just your role in your current organization. So Chris, let's get started with you.
Okay, great. So my name is Chris Livaccari again. Thank you, Neelam. It's good to see you. I'm the head of school at Presidio Knolls School. We are a Mandarin immersion school here in San Francisco. We have about 400 students in our program from preschool, starting with 2.5-year-olds, all the way up to 8th graders. So we do a very rigorous but progressive approach to Mandarin immersion education, starting with the Reggio Emilia program in our preschool, through inquiry and project-based programs in elementary and middle school that culminate in normal years, not for the last two, with experiential learning that happens in China and Taiwan in grades 5, 6, 7, and 8. And the kids are really doing project-based learning experiences, and internships, and documentaries and research, not just visiting the Great Wall and waving flags and things like that. So it's a really fun thing I get to do, to work with 400 kids every day, and we teach through 5th grade almost exclusively in Mandarin, and then we bring in a little more English in the middle school. So it's a really fun, exciting, hands-on program, and I get to use Chinese throughout the day. So I really, really enjoy what I do.
Great, thank you. Yalan?
So by way of background, I actually have a degree in systems design engineering and started off working in high-tech innovations and marketing. And from there, I transitioned into startups because I'm in Silicon Valley and we're kind of at the heart of startups. And then I went into nonprofits. I'm, as you mentioned, also the executive director of the Mandarin Institute, and I have been a program director of the National Security Agency StarTalk programs. I've run over 20 StarTalk programs, and we were very happy to have been able to do our last one in person this summer again after a little hiatus last year. Currently, I am the Chief Commercial Officer at Mandarin Matrix. Mandarin Matrix is an EdTech company that provides an online platform for K-12 students to help them learn Chinese. We have both curriculum and teaching resources, so we make teaching and learning Chinese more effective for both teachers and students. In my role as CCO, I have responsibility overall for sales and business development. I am involved in all aspects of the company, from product development through to customer interactions, through to strategic decisions and strategic direction. I am very honored to be able to work with schools, such as Chris mentioned what Presidio Knolls does. I work with schools not only across the country, but globally. My main focus right now is, or our largest install base is in the US. So I'm very honored to be working with immersion schools across the country. But in addition to that, I also work with middle school and high school foreign language programs.
Great, very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. So now the question I guess everyone wants to know, or many people ask, why China? So more specifically, how did your interest in China emerge? And we'll start again with Chris.
Thanks, Neelam. Yeah, my interest in China really started with an interest in languages. And so ever since I was a child, I was obsessed with languages, started with accents, with British accents. And that was like an obsession I had as a child. When I got to middle school, I was finally able to take a foreign language, which was Spanish. And then in high school, I got the even more exciting experience to take Russian. And so I studied Russian all throughout high school and Spanish as well. I was even able to go to what was then the Soviet Union. I'm going to date myself big time, back in like 1989 when I was in high school. And I got to like have that experience of learning a language and then going off to the country and experiencing it in person. When I got to college, I was, again, so excited about languages that I actually decided Spanish and Russian were great, but I wanted to try something more challenging, more different than English. And so I wound up studying both Chinese and Japanese as an undergraduate. And this was back in the days, in the early 90s, when Japan was still really a dominant economic force in the world. And everyone was learning Japanese. So I went to my first year Japanese class. It was one of like 5 sections, each of which had like 30 or 40 students. It was like a huge program. And then I'd go to Chinese class and it would be like 5 or 6, mostly kids who spoke Chinese at home and me sitting around a table. So it was a very different world back then. But that's really how I got into China, was through language. And then when I graduated from college, before I went to graduate school, I spent a year in Shandong province I'm going to say a small city called Yantai, but it's not really that small, actually. It's only small by Chinese standards. But yeah, so I had a really immersive experience because I went to kind of a place that was a little bit off the beaten track, because I wanted to really immerse myself in the language, which I did. But it was also a very kind of overwhelming experience because it's so extremely different from what I knew growing up in New York and going to college in New York City. So that's how I got into China, through the language. Studied language and literature in undergraduate and then also in graduate school. And then between that time, again, I spent a year in Shandong province, which was pretty formative to my future life.
Wow, yes. So this is something that you've been interested, obviously, since you were very young. So fascinating. Thank you. Neelam, how about you?
For me, it's personal, and it's because it's part of my heritage. My father was born in Shanghai and my mother was born in Taiwan, and they were first generation immigrants to Canada. I'm actually Canadian. And so I'm second generation. And for our family, it was all about assimilation. And the being in the sort of like, just I'll digress a little bit, but being in Canada, it's described more as a mosaic where people maintain their own their own heritage, but they are like Chinese Canadian, for example. But in the U.S., it's described more as a melting pot where we all become American. And so when my daughter was born, my husband and I decided early on that we would be errant as parents if we didn't raise her bilingually, because we both believed strongly in immersion, both in the brain development as well for our child, as well as the linguistics. So having my daughter be fluent in Chinese was just as important to us as parents as her having a healthy lifestyle and a solid education. We felt very strongly that the math, the science, the reading, we can help her do that. But the language, it's all about actually practicing and having the time, and only in an immersion program and only starting in a young age, particularly for Chinese, would she be able to do that. So that's really what got me into it. And then
click the video share.
And then what happened was that when I was looking around, we were looking around for Mandarin immersion schools for my daughter. Surprisingly, in San Francisco, there were no Mandarin immersion programs in the public school system. So then I got involved and started a nonprofit with some other parents to start the first 2 Mandarin immersion programs in in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then from there, I got recruited to start the Mandarin Institute. So it's really my daughter that got me into all that. I mean, and I think that as I've been in this field, it for a lot of us, it's our kids that got us into this, because we want our kids to be part of that global future.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that. You know, I was born here too, and I'm Indian, and they call us ABCDs because we were born here, but kind of don't have an identity, right? We're here, we're there. And same thing, my husband and I are committed to the children learning Hindi or knowing it. It is a big part of it, and I do appreciate that story. So lucky for us, Sonya has joined us, and I just wanted to take a brief moment and briefly pause to introduce her. Welcome, Sonya. She's an educator in Hawaii, I believe, currently, and she is an experienced program specialist with a history of working in the education and management industry. She's currently an SEN supporter and kindergarten teacher at Emirates National Schools. And welcome, Sonya. So we've kind of been getting started, talking a little bit about, why China, what your interest was, how did that interest emerge? So if you want to just take a moment to share that with our audience.
And I'll be very brief because I apologize for the tech issues. I'm still in Hawaii, and I'm currently working at Konowena Elementary School. But my interest in working in China actually began in 2010. And this was honestly due to the financial bubble popping when everything was going through a shift because of the finance of the U.S. And there were some downsizing at my school. Of course, I'd been there for almost 20 years, and I worked as the gifted and talented coordinator. And then there was going to be a shift from the coordinator's position, maybe as an assistant principal or principal. And I thought, well, I've been in the system for almost 18 years. It's just time for a change. And I just didn't know how big of a change I was going to do when I accepted a position as a language learner director at Disney English. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Disney English and the learning centers that were there. And I thought, well, I'll do that. And of course, being an African-American woman in a leadership position, overseeing a group of teachers in an unfamiliar environment was quite a major undertaking, but I enjoyed it so much. And I stayed in China for 7 years, working in different industries with education, from teaching and directing and language directing, all of that. So it has been a wonderful whirlwind experience. And now I went to the Middle East, and now I'm in Hawaii. So Dream Island, here I am.
Truly a global citizen, yes, absolutely. So we're glad you can join us. So our next question is for Sonya and Chris, actually. So, Sonya, you just mentioned, and Chris, you have too, that you've both lived in China at different stages of your career. If you can tell us a little bit about your first time living in China, which Sonya, I think you already alluded to a little bit, and how did that shape your career in education? So let's start with Chris.
Well, thanks.
Well, in shaping my, Chris, you're going? Go ahead, Chris.
Go ahead, Sonya. Why don't you continue? That's fine.
Oh, okay. Well, in shaping my view of education, it solidified my knowledge. It made me really confident in what I know about teaching English and working with children. And it was a different environment. Of course, the language barriers and understanding that, there are the challenges of getting children to connect to you with the different levels of culture. That was the biggest undertaking. Teaching has always been a breeze for me, even when we've gone through COVID and virtual. It's just like I tell teachers, teaching is teaching in any type of regards. But the major undertaking was the language contact and language connections with children and parents, and making sure that there was a clear understanding between what their expectations were and what my expectations were in terms of learning and the environment that we were creating. And so that was the major battle to climb. And it's just getting that cultural dissonance that might be there to level that playing field and really get into what are the expectations for learning, and even for like temperature setting in a classroom. Here in America, we have different temperature settings. No one really talks about how cold or warm it is. If the kids are cold, hey, turn up the heat if they're too hot, open up a window. And for that, in China, of course, it's a specific temperature setting, and the parents wanted it that way. And it was stated across the schools that I worked in that that's a stated cultural understanding. There's a specific temperature and understanding of how children should feel in that learning environment. So all of these things were new. And so if you get the nuances of the culture, you really can then delve into the real teaching at those points.
Great, thank you for that. Chris, how about you?
Oh yeah, thanks, Neelam. So I think I alluded to in the earlier question that my first time in China was in 1994. Again, getting old, right? It was right after I graduated from college. So I'd studied Chinese and Japanese literature, was getting ready to go to graduate school in that field as well. And I wanted to do a year in either China or Japan to really solidify some of my language skills. And I thought, I was really ambitious because I hadn't lived overseas or really traveled very much overseas. I mentioned I'd been in Russia briefly as a language student in high school. But I decided to go to somewhere that was not Beijing or Shanghai. Now, this is a very different China, again, 25 years ago. So it's a very different China than what is there now. And I went to, a school in Shandong province. Actually, it was a college that was part of the coal ministry. So at China at this time, I had a Meitanbu, a coal ministry, a ministry of mining, essentially. And this was a college that was owned by the coal ministry. And like Sonya, actually, I was teaching English there, but my real purpose was I wanted to really learn Chinese. And it was a great opportunity to do that because there were really no other foreigners around me. I really was off in my own little world. I was really immersed. I was pretty much the same age as many of my students. So I was in my early 20s. They were in their early 20s. So I really just got kind of adopted by this entire extended family of Chinese students that became my deep, deep close friends. And that was my first experience in China. And I went back as a foreign service officer, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. And then later for Asia Society, when I was working in the same department that Neelam is leading now, actually. But I would go to China probably 6 or 7 times a year, running a few programs over the course of about the 5 years I was there. But the first time I was in what was then kind of the middle of nowhere in Yantai, but a beautiful coastal city where they say you can see Penglai and the coast of Korea. So anyway, many years ago.
That's great. Thank you for that explanation. So Yellen, let's get back to you. Why do you think knowing about China is important?
I think that there is no global decision that is going to be made in the next 3 decades and probably in the future where we are not going to have China and the US being at the table. Just because of the size and the influence of both countries. Every Chinese student is learning English. Only a fraction of US students are learning Chinese. We need to have people who are seated at the table making global decisions that understand, if you will, the other guests at the table. I think that when you learn a language, you of course learn the culture. And it is a significant disadvantage for anyone to think that a person who understands Chinese and English and a person who only understands English, I feel like you only have half the picture and maybe even less than half the picture because culture is so prevalent and important in how people think and in how they make decisions. Then the other thing I would add to it is that we've been talking about the global economy of the future. Well, guess what? We're in it. There isn't any, if you're going to work in a major company, there isn't any company that is not going, you're not going to interact with either a department or someone from China. And again, the same reasoning happens there. So from my perspective, I think that that's why knowing about China is so important.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think there's also, you mentioned the cultural component, and I think Chinese culture has so much to offer everybody around the world. It is an ancient culture. There's so much around religion, food, the arts, just basic teachings. I think that anybody who really wants to think about themselves as a global citizen and somebody who wants to think about themselves as somebody who can reach out with a Chinese person or somebody who's grown up in the culture, I think should definitely be interested in learning more about it. So yes, I mean, at the Center of Global Education, we're definitely all about language and culture and combining the both. So I appreciate that, those comments. Before we go into the next question, does anybody want to also add to anything Neelam said around why do you think knowing Chinese is important, or knowing about China is important? Anything that you'd like to add, Chris or Sonya?
I can vouch for that one. Of course, coming from Atlanta, Georgia, which is my hometown, and that was my first living international experience living in China. So that was, to me, honestly, a major jump. And to not realize like you said, there are not a strong number of people that actually speak Chinese. And I was located in Beijing for a period of time, Shanghai for a period of time, and Hangzhou. All of these have strong English language supports within the communities, but not strong, where you can just say, hey, taxi driver, take me down the street, or, where's this learning center? And so learning some Chinese was critical mass. I mean, when you're talking cultural explosion, it goes beyond ni hao and ni hao ma. It really gets into, can you count this money at the grocery store? And so it was a quick learn. And so it was a great learning experience for me to just do some language immersion. My language of my Mandarin is not as strong as it should be after 7 years. I took courses. I worked with my coworkers to, hey, let's go out and have dinner at the restaurant for lunch, and you teach me Chinese, I teach you English, we have some tea or coffee, and that's how I was surviving. And it was a language survival for me, not so much the language immersion, but a survival. But it was a great opportunity. And if China had the doors open today, I would hop right back over if COVID settles down. And I would love to do some more things there because I truly miss it. I miss friends that are there in the culture for sure.
Great.
I would just add, I mean, I think as I sort of stated up front, I'm a fan of all languages. So I tend not to be the person that's saying Chinese over other things. But the one really unique thing about Chinese, of course, is the writing system. And for kids that I work with in my school and other schools that I work with, I think what's really exciting about them learning Chinese in addition to English and other languages they may be learning is just the cognitive benefits that they get from learning to read and write in Chinese, because it does utilize different areas of your brain and different competencies than most alphabetic or syllabic systems use. So that's a really cool feature of Chinese. But I'm excited for kids to learn all languages. So I'm never going to be the one who says Chinese over anything else. Hindi and Arabic and Spanish are all great too. So
it's all great, yeah. Right. Especially in the United States. I mean, not many students have the opportunity to learn another language. So, just having that opportunity to learn any language, I think is such a great thing. So yeah, thank you for those comments. So Chris, we have another question for you. You started your career working as a Foreign Service officer, as we mentioned earlier. Why did you decide to shift your career to education? And how did you leverage your language skills in Japanese and Chinese and Foreign Service and education?
Yeah, thank you, Neelam. So I was in the Foreign Service for about 5 years. It was my first career out of graduate school. And I had studied a lot of really esoteric things, especially things like classical Chinese and Japanese literature and the history of Buddhism in East Asia. And suddenly I'm standing in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, and I've got to figure out a presidential visit. And I've got White House staffers yelling and screaming at me. And I'm like, wow, this is a very different experience than learning language in this very kind of ivory tower world that I had started out in. So I spent some time in the Foreign Service. It was one of the great formative experiences of my life, especially the 3+ years I spent in Tokyo, where I did a lot of presidential visits, a lot of congressional delegations, a lot of work with the ambassador on public affairs and public events. And then I spent a year back in China, in Shanghai as well. And so the pivot I made was really because I'd always been an educator. I'd always, again, been really involved with language education, with history, with culture, with literature. And the Foreign Service was a great experience for me. I must say that I went into the Foreign Service to really do cultural and educational exchange work, which was a big thing back in the day. Post 9/11, however, the priorities and the resources of the U.S. government really were shifted away from that and completely towards supporting U.S. policies. And that wasn't something that I was as excited about as I was to do people-to-people exchanges, to do cultural and educational support. In the old days, Foreign Service officers administered things like the Fulbright program. We sent arts groups, music groups back and forth to different countries. We promoted dialogue on, in my case, it was issues like North Korea. In Japan, we had North Korean, Chinese, we had South Korean, Chinese, U.S., Russian experts come together to talk about how do we deal with North Korea? So it was a really, it started out as a really kind of open place to promote dialogue between the U.S. and the rest of the world. And then gradually over those 5 years, it became much more a place where the resources that we had were being deployed just to support U.S. policies. So I decided, this isn't really going in the right direction for me personally. Although I had great experiences, I still have many dear friends in the Foreign Service. And I just decided to actually come back to the U.S. to kind of step back into education. And that's where Asia Society really came into the picture for me, because I had known Asia Society through the Foreign Service, through a conference we used to do called the Williamsburg Conference, which is many years has not been done. But that was something I attended with our ambassador when I was in Japan. And then when I got back to the U.S., got back into education, Asia Society was at the very starting point of starting a network of international studies schools. And so I leapt from the Foreign Service back into education and had the real privilege of working with Asia Society on those schools.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go back to Yalan and then come back to you, Sonya. So my question for you, Yalan, is you facilitated the first Mandarin immersion schools in the public school system in the Bay Area, as you mentioned, in SFUSD, and created a pathway for high school students to get concurrent credit in Chinese in college. Why was this important to you? And how can students leverage their skills and cultural competence in careers in education in the U.S.?
Great, thank you. So as I mentioned, because there were no schools in San Francisco Unified School District or the public schools in the Bay Area, I actually started a nonprofit to work with other parents to get that going. But guess what? Once they finish elementary school, we got to do something in middle school. So we had to matriculate and get the district to open up a middle school program. And then once they do middle school, they needed to go to high school. But because these kids were in immersion programs, their level of Chinese surpassed what was available for them in high school, or at the very least, it was at the AP level. So I started a pathway for students as young as 13 years old to actually take Chinese college classes. They actually went onto campus at college. So students literally started college the same day that they started high school. And these students received concurrent high school and college credit for their Chinese classes. It was important to me to have the full articulation from kindergarten through to college, because it's important to me that students have a working knowledge of Chinese. By that, I mean that they need to be able to work in the target language. And as educators, we know that if they only have like a novice level of proficiency, they're only going to be able to do sort of rudimentary level jobs. And not that that's not important, but to me, I wanted them to fully participate in the global economy and to be able to work in whatever capacity that they wanted to work in bilingually. And as to why it's another reason for why it's important, I remember the first day of the first Mandarin immersion class that started. A young African American mom. She was a single mom. She was the first parent to enroll her son in the class, and she was from the projects. And we asked her, why are you putting your son into a Chinese program? And I'll never forget this. She said, it's a way in and a way out. And I thought that, wow, that just said it all. And again, I also alluded to this earlier. There is not going to be any career path moving forward where as an individual, you are not going to interact with Chinese people, either as colleagues or as customers, and being able to interact with them in their language will give you an edge, an advantage. Another compliment, actually the biggest compliment I ever received in my whole career, was I after the Mandarin immersion programs were started, I was literally crossing a street and a parent pointed to me and she said, "You have changed the future of my children." And I was like, and to me, I mean, it's and we all do this in every day in our lives. We do this. It's just not every day that somebody tells you that, but I think that is really important, because when if you're a university student and you're competing for your first job, you are no longer competing with the kid down the street or another child or another individual in your city or your neighborhood or even in your country. You are competing with kids from around the world. And if there are two people who are equally qualified for a position, but one is multilingual, guess who's going to get hired? So I think that it is a personal advantage, not only to your career, but also to your development and also to your life. As all of the individuals here have said, they've lived in other countries, and I don't think anybody can live in another country and not grow from that experience. And I think that this is something that students can do for themselves.
Thank you very much. And I think you raised a really good point around how language needs to go from the very basic to, like, how to have a basic conversation or ask where the bathroom is or whatever, but really being able to participate in the language in, science and mathematics and in law. You want students to be able to understand and read and converse in a variety of different subject areas. And I think that's something that is difficult to find. So it's very impressive that you were able to create kind of this pathway for students, which I think is very needed in language learning. So thanks for sharing that. So Sonya, I'm going to come back to you now. You worked in the Georgia school system as an educator for a number of years. Why did you make the shift to teach in China? And what are some important tips that students should know if they're interested in international teaching careers?
Well, that's a good question, or good questions, I should say. And again, my initial interest, of course, when we first learn of countries is in our own educational setting. And I remember in 6th grade, and a social studies book, opening up this book and seeing the amazing Great Wall of China. And never in my life would I have envisioned as a middle school student in 6th grade that I would not only live there, but work there. So it was truly an amazing connection for me. And just to think, little Southern Black girl is now working and living in China. And my first thought was, I saw the Great Wall in a textbook and how powerful that was for me. In my own, personal development. But my interest in encouraging others to work in China, and particularly people of color, just to give you a little spill in, I'm working on a book currently with a friend who is still teaching in Shenzhen, and she and I worked during the past year on a book on getting teachers, particularly teachers of color, to work in China. And I want to push and encourage that, because children need to see diversity. It's more than just seeing, sports celebrities and sports figures on the TV and seeing these, far-stretched individuals who have made career gains. They need to see everyday people walking next to them, talking with them, eating in the same restaurant. They need to see this emerging of culture, because if you're saying we're creating a global citizen, the best way to do that is through connections with other people. So to encourage more people, more students to work in China is my charge at this point, because I think it's a win-win for both, Chinese students of any age level and the person who goes there. It is an interchange and exchange of knowledge and information that you don't get in a textbook. I mean, to see the Great Wall of China on a page in a book was not like walking that Great Wall of China, seeing a scorpion and experience the coldness and the different seasonal changes. There is no comparison between what you see in a textbook. So encouraging others to go in, take the lead, communicate with people, learn the language, eat the lovely different cuisines, and just truly have that immersion of life is what global citizenship should truly be about, and teachers should take advantage of that, particularly young ones. I'm an older teacher now. I don't know if I have the energy. I'm barely making it in Hawaii, and it's gorgeous sunsets and rainbows, and I'm struggling. So I don't. China for me might be a different level. But definitely for the young ones who just, starting career paths, give that an opportunity and venture out, and you'll truly enjoy that experience.
Great. So I have one more question for you all, but before we do that, there is a question in the chat I see. I don't know if you all have access to the chat. We have a teacher or an audience member asking, what are the best websites to look at for an ESL teaching job in China? So if you have any tips on that, if you could add that to the chat. Do you see that question? Okay, great. So while we're talking, if you have a moment, please, you can include any information you have. That'd be great. And I guess my final question for all of you, the same question, is what advice do you have for the attendees? Anything around teaching in China, working in China, learning the language, whatever it is, any advice that you could offer to our attendees. Yalan, why don't we start with you?
I would say immerse yourself and embrace every opportunity that you can. If there is an opportunity to travel to China and to be there for any amount of time, I think that is going to give you a different perspective and a true appreciation for what you are studying. And then embrace every opportunity you have to expand and to interact with people, and as Chris said, multilingual and multi ethnicities. I think that the more that we are talking to others, the more that we learn and the more perspective we get.
Thank you. Christopher, how about you?
Well, yeah, I guess I would say there was a time when many people thought if you learn Chinese, you were sort of guaranteed to have a job and all this stuff. In fact, I once heard one of the U.S. ambassadors to China say this to an audience of students, and I thought, oh no, actually, because my advice would be learning Chinese, for example, is not enough. That actually I would just encourage anyone who's seeking an opportunity in China to really build yourself in terms of your career in whatever field you want to go in. So if it's in education, develop real credentials in education, go to graduate school, do a deep dive, really think about what you want to do, because the days are long gone when just any English speaker showing up in China, would just get a job or get hired. You really have to have your credentials and have your A game. So, develop your overall skill set in addition to whatever language or cultural skills you develop.
Sonya? Any advice for our attendees?
Attendees network, as Yalan and Christopher were saying, is more than language immersion, and also developing your career, your tools in your tool chest, get your ESL, get all the things that you need to prepare to do an amazing job about teaching. It's about quality of instructions, so make sure you're ready for the level of instructional support that you need to bring to the table. You'll develop while you're there, get the development, but you do need to bring some additional to the table. But it's also about networking, get to know people in your own town, find these lovely people who are in your town and connect and talk to them about living there, experiences there, and take a visit, as you say, Neelam, take a visit, you'll see it for yourself. But make those connections initially, feel confident and comfortable in your own skin, and you'll be ready to venture over and make the great connection between cultures.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you. Are there any final comments? You guys had some great advice. Any other final thing you'd like to add? I think we have about a minute or two left.
I
think you're breaking up a little bit. Is she breaking up for you all? Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, you could try again. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so maybe while she's trying to fix her technical issues, I'm just going to go ahead and conclude the panel. I just want to say that this is a really amazing conversation. I think that, me working at Asia Society at the Center for Global Education, also being a parent of, raising bilingual children, I've learned a ton. And, one thing that I think is just so amazing about the education field, for those of you that are interested in going in there, it's a way to travel the world. I mean, you could take the opportunity to really, travel to so many places if you can, and learn, about the culture in a very immersive way. So I think whether it's China or any other country, I think you're just open to so many different opportunities. And like our panelists have already mentioned, it's just an awesome experience that you could have, and a really great way to kind of build your resume for whatever it is that you want to do in the future. I think we have one more question. I don't know how much time we have. Let's see. Oh, Chris, you did answer it.
I gave my suggestion, just based on experience with kids traveling internationally, like and how much they can actually absorb and how it impacts them. And I think around sort of third grade, fourth grade, that age, they can really get a lot and they can really grow as people from those experiences. Younger is fine too, but I think they pick up a little bit less. So I'd say like around like third grade-ish is a good time to get kids traveling overseas.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so with that, we're going to conclude the panel. I appreciate all of your time and your thoughts. This was such an honor to meet all of you, and thank you very much. Have a great day.